So this is a concept that I've had brewing for a little while, and if you dislike it, rest secure in the knowledge that as it's a one-off special, it will be the first and only of its kind. It's early 2013, and with swirling rumors permeating every square inch of the professional gaming media, the trafficking of unsubstantiated and often fallacious rumors, after all, being their primary purview, I figured that regardless of what the coming year bears for gaming, one simple fact is true. The seventh and most recent console generation is at long last drawing to a close. But before slapping a toe tag on this croaker and relegating it to an urn on the mantelpiece of gaming history, it's time to sharpen the scalpels and discern the cause of death. With most generations, it's natural causes, but with recent events and the industry's dramatic crash over the past 4 years, I don't think I'll rule out homicide. Labored analogies aside, it's time for the Rageaholic's comprehensive post-mortem of the seventh console generation. Well, if you're going to start, you may as well do so at the top, and no console stood more proudly atop the monetary mountain this generation than the Michael Jackson's Thriller of video game consoles, the Nintendo Wii. And while it's a petty and trifling complaint, I'll itemize it all the same, given the fact that it was arguably the first console in history to properly tap the power of motion control and capitalize on the burgeoning casual market. Nintendo should have gone with their first instinct and called this system the Revolution, because for all its latter-day failings, and they are legion, the Nintendo Wii, for a very brief moment in time, was a motherfucking revolution. It had the buzz, it had the audience, and for a while it definitely had the games, and at a relatively humble $250 price point, the Nintendo Wii was never once not worth owning. So prodigious was Nintendo's lead that even after 4 straight years of miserably diminished returns, the Big N's rivals are still effectively fighting for a distant second place. It seems like a strange thing to say for a console that was effectively the Tickle Me Elmo of 2007, but in many ways this is a system that's deeply underrated. In terms of motion control and user interface alone, if nothing else, prior to the Wii, gamers' only experience with motion-controlled gaming were third-party bargain basement peripherals like the Sega Interactor, which, as anyone who's ever used the fucking thing will attest, is touchier than a titty bar for the blind. Nintendo actually managed to make motion control a viable interface for modern gaming. An aspiration the industry has made repeated, embarrassingly poorly executed attempts at since the late 1980s, but Nintendo finally cracked the fucking code. You can say all you want about Nintendo's hype, marketing, and mainstream buzz, but at the end of the day, for innovating in that singular regard, Nintendo deserved every red penny they made off the system, and then subsequently wasted on the Wii U. Look, I wax decidedly negative on modern gaming, and with good reasons given the developments of the last 4 years, but mark my fucking words when I say that history will remember the Nintendo Wii as the Nintendo Revolution. Godspeed, Nintendo Wii. For the proper gamers, then, the big winner this go-around was undoubtedly the Xbox 360. Look, they soundly trounced both Sony and Nintendo for over a year, the first feat of its kind for a North American video game console, and to this day they continue to enjoy an insurmountable lead in software sales over the PlayStation 3, even without the benefit of virtually any Japanese sales whatsoever. You need to pause and process that for just a moment, because the Xbox 360 outselling the PlayStation 3, even though for the past 3 years the console is no longer being sold in the largest video games consumer market in the world. It's like watching Glass Joe beat Mike Tyson's ass like a narc at a crack house with one hand tied behind his back. Look, for all the negativity I've hurled Microsoft's way, and in recent years it's become positively copious, that is a feather that can and should never be removed from Microsoft's cap. Simply put, Microsoft found their wings this generation. After a promising but ultimately disappointing launch of the original Xbox, they rallied the troops, they hit the skids early, and they walked out of this generation with possibly the most impressive launch of any company, which may seem quizzical given the fact that I just creamed my long johns over the Nintendo Wii's successful launch, but Rageaholics, let's make one thing perfectly clear. In commerce, there are two kinds of success. There's success, and then there's Oprah success. The defining qualifier for which is simple. When Oprah devotes an episode to discussing your product, you are officially Oprah successful. The Xbox 360 has closed the wide sales gap between itself and the Wii without the benefit of ever being Oprah successful, and that is a Herculean feat all its own. Perhaps more importantly, and rarely touched upon, is the Xbox 360 served as the centerpiece for a rapid, industry-wide developmental paradigm shift. In short, we went from a Nihongo-centric model that placed the wants and needs of the lucrative Japanese gaming industry above all else, to a much more diverse European and American-dominated industry that now even has titans of Japanese industry, people with surnames like Kojima, Yamaoka, and Mikami, that everyday gamers recognize, outright admitting that Japan has been left in the dust. Look, call me a nationalist, but I take some pride in knowing that North American RPG developers have suddenly gone from a quaint novelty with games like Wizardry, Daggerfall, and Ultima, to full-on running the fucking show with titles like Deus Ex, Fallout, and Skyrim. And while we often dwell on the homogenized progeny that recent development is born, let's pause for a moment and contemplate the positive side of the more westernized video game development culture. You remember in the late 90s, toward the end of the PS1's life cycle, when it often felt like you were a hapless bystander, subjected to a ceaseless barrage of melodramatic cutscenes, turn-based grinding, and linear gameplay? Well, now most of that shit is real-time and rendered in fucking engine. Most of those games are open-ended, sometimes sandboxes, other times featuring a simple narrative fork. But it's a very strong step in the right direction, and a welcome change from the same old vapid shit Japan was cranking out for the better part of a decade. Remember how if you played a game from a company like Konami or Capcom back in the day, and you felt dissatisfied or wanted to make suggestions to the developers, you were effectively SOL, not just due to the absence of a viable audience feedback structure, but quite frankly, due to Japanese developmental arrogance. Simply put, those companies didn't give one iota of a fuck what you thought about their games because, by God, they're Squaresoft and they know better than you. Well, that's at least been partially modified now. The Stanley Woos of the world are a negative byproduct of a very positive, primarily Western development, and that is that video game developers actually now open forums, incite their audiences to disseminate their opinion, and occasionally actually give a shit what gamers think. Look, none of that would have ever happened if Japanese developers were still cock of the walk, and the success of the Xbox 360 is seated square in the eye of that hurricane. If Sony had remained dominant this generation, gaming would have continued to be the feudal dictatorship it was during the PS2 era, and for that alone, I consider the 360 a resounding success and a very welcome alternative to the other two far more Japanese-centric console manufacturers. Failure rates that rival Bob Dole's Crank notwithstanding. A hearty Godspeed to the Xbox 360.
It's almost over. It's just a matter of time.
Sony, on the other hand, took one squarely on the chin this go-around, and in the cock, and in the throat, and in the temple, and in the brain. After a tepid, somewhat debatable victory with the original PlayStation, and then just flat out running away with the entire goddamn console generation with the PS2, Sony quite simply indulged their corporate engineering arrogance to a repulsive degree and pissed away every cent of their PS2 profit pile, launching out of the gate at the much maligned price point of $599 US, $599 US, at a price point that made purchasing a gold-plated space-age NASA supercomputer a more cost-effective alternative. They'd already blown their entire fucking foot off, but the truth didn't truly begin to show in the muck until they imbibed in one last indulgence. They allowed Sony's engineering and R&D division to run roughshod over Sony's corporate leadership. They slapped a prohibitively expensive Blu-ray drive onto the machine in order to win a format war that 7 fucking years later, consumers still aren't interested in buying. They went ahead and crammed a laughably inefficient cell processor that ultimately underperformed when compared to the competition into their waffle iron-looking chassis and myriad other masturbatory tech that gamers were ultimately far less interested in than whether or not they had some fucking games to play, which for the first 3 years of the console's life cycle, they most decidedly fucking didn't. To make matters worse, when R&D unsurprisingly went over budget while designing the console, they concealed this fact from the company's CEO until it was too late, meaning every solitary PlayStation 3 had to be sold at a loss, and a massive one, until 4 years into its death cycle. The inclusion of this exotic and ultimately overstated tech was proven an even more disastrous decision, as even seasoned third-party developers found themselves laboring to develop games on the console's needlessly convoluted cell processing architecture. Some developers, like Valve's Gabe Newell, were even famously quoted as initially refusing to ever produce a game for the console, presumably while feeding a Twilight Dancer to his pet Rancor. And while that rhetoric was ultimately proven more empty than a Kardashian bookshelf, as appears quite evident in exceedingly glitchy modern PS3 releases like Skyrim and Red Dead Redemption, clearly when it comes to the cell processor, developers, much like a Kobe Bryant dinner date, are still fucking struggling. Sony's responded by locking developers into absurdly restrictive first-party contracts to develop games exclusively for their flagging systems, and in many cases, this has come at the expense of the developers' livelihoods. While Sony could get away with this underhanded bullshit in the PS2 era thanks to a raging case of only game in town syndrome, when a company signs on to develop for Sony only to release one flop and find themselves liquidated by their parent entity, the business practices of Sony Electronic Entertainment begin to lapse into the downright nefarious. This generation has seen the death of an unprecedented number of Sony exclusive developers, most of whom were shuttered by Sony themselves or simply severed from the corporate teat and left to die a slow withering death in a fiscal wasteland after one failed release. The message to first-party exclusive developers from Sony HQ has been simple. We want your games, but after that you can take a long walk off a short bridge. Zipper Interactive, makers of SOCOM and MAG, Superbot Games, a studio formed by Sony for the express purpose of cranking out PlayStation All-Smash, was exiled from the kingdom just last month. Sony Entertainment Liverpool, also known as Psygnosis, makers of, I believe, Wipeout and Colony Wars. Sony Entertainment Cambridge, makers of Medieval and the PSP version of Little Big Planet. 989 Studios, makers of Siphon Filter and Latter-day Twisted Metal. Lightbox Interactive, Incognito Entertainment, the list is endless. And yet frothing fanboys will hail Electronic Arts as the neon antichrist as they steadily lead BioWare on their long walk to the gallows and join their compatriots at Pandemic and Westwood, while ignoring that Sony set the fucking mold for this profligate behavior. Look, I'd love to focus on the positive with Sony this generation, but for Sony, this truly is a post-mortem. The PS Vita and the PSP Go were dead on arrival. Fuck, even the PlayStation 3, after righting the ship and supposedly selling more consoles than the Xbox 360, again, a figure that's bloated by the fact that the PS3 is sold in more territories than the Xbox 360, is still a resounding failure. For Sony, there are very few successes and a fucking hope chest filled with festering failures. And that's all they have to take away for the 7th console generation. And I'm sorry to say, but promoting Kaz Hirai, the man largely responsible for launching the torpid tandem of the PSP and PS3 to clean corporate house, it's like handing a pyromaniac a Zippo and telling him to fight a fucking forest fire. Sony could have co-developed a more profitable Technodrome with Krang and the fucking Shredder and actually been perceived as less evil in the aftermath. Given the sheer number of divisions from which Sony is positively hemorrhaging money, correcting their past transgressions with the PS4 may actually be too little too late. But I'm far from hoping from their fall. As wrestling fans have learned from WWE's last, decade of dominance, an absence of viable competition is a prelude to self-destruction. So hang in there if possible, Sony, because nobody wants a two-world order, let alone a Microsoft or Nintendo dictatorship. Godspeed into the afterlife, PlayStation 3. The 7th console generation was characterized by highs that rivaled Everest and lows that outstripped the Mariana Trench. I firmly believe that history will record this as easily the most polarizing and controversial generation the industry has ever seen. In the immortal words of Shakespeare's Macduff, such welcome and unwelcome things at once, 'tis hard to reconcile, which of course he uttered shortly before chopping the king's fucking head off and parading it around Scotland like Rowdy Roddy Piper on peyote buttons. Bringing home one final point to all three companies, Nintendo, Sony, Microsoft. Tread fucking lightly. I'm Razorfist. God fucking speed.